Some things are soluble, some things are not. And here's why.
I used to see sunrise when I gave the word. Now in the morning I sleep alone. Sweep the streets I used to.
Ionic compounds, as we all are familiar with, are compounds that usually contain a metal and a non-metal bonded with a strong electrostatic attraction between the positive and negative ions. As we learned last year, ionic compounds tend to be soluble in water, though what we sometimes forget is why some of them are soluble. So let's start with that. Water is a covalent molecule whose electrons in its bonds are more attracted towards the oxygen end of the bond, hence making the oxygen slightly negative and the hydrogen slightly positive. In other words, the molecule is polar. This means that reasonably strong forces can be formed between the water molecules and ions, which provides the energy to break the lattice of an ionic substance apart. However, some ionic substances are not soluble in water because the attractions between the water molecules and the ions aren't strong enough to overcome the very strong electrostatic forces of attraction of the ionic compound. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get to some of the examples. All ionic compounds involving nitrate are soluble. Think of it as England's path to the World Cup semis, the clearest day.
In itself for this new team.
Ionic compounds including chlorine face the same story. They are all soluble well, except for lead and silver, who always form insoluble compounds except for when they are with nitrate. Sulfate is a bit more confusing to remember, but try to learn this rhyme. To remember sulfate, calcium and silver are slight hesitate, but barium and lead don't tolerate. It's definitely cringe, but it gets the job done. By the way, slight hesitate means it's slightly soluble. Carbonates, however, are almost always insoluble, except for when with ammonium, potassium, or sodium. And lastly, all hydroxides are insoluble except for ammonium, potassium, sodium, and barium. Calcium, on the other hand, is almost soluble, so just slightly. So the key things to remember from this video is that all nitrates are soluble. Anything involving ammonium, potassium, or sodium is soluble. Most chlorides are soluble except for lead and copper. Sulfate is tricky, so remember the rhyme. To remember sulfate, calcium and silver are slight hesitate, but barium and lead don't tolerate. All carbohydrates and hydroxides are insoluble except for ammonium, potassium, and sodium. And barium hydroxide is soluble, and calcium hydroxide is slightly soluble. And that's all you need to know. And now to the end of this video is an interactive quiz. By pressing one of the buttons on screen, you'll be directed to another tab. So let's begin then with the first question. Is barium sulfate soluble?